quite the education of a lifetime in terms of labor activism, black lung, medical politics, and so on. And that context really has shaped my own approach to black lung, which really focuses on the workplace, the struggles between miners and operators over the conditions of work, the role of the union in that, the United Mine Workers of America, and of course the policies and actions of coal company owners and supervisors in the mines. So let me invite Chris to say a few words by way of his own introduction.
Yeah, well, thank you, Barbara Ellen, and also just want to reiterate thank you to Haymarket and to Little Brown for hosting this, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in. My history with black lung does not go back. I don't have the deep history that Barbara Ellen does, but it was a real pleasure when I was working on this book to get to learn about some of the work of the original black lung movement. But my time with black lung really goes back to 2011, which was when I was a reporter at the nonprofit investigative news outlet, the Center for Public Integrity. And we had gotten, so I was covering labor and environmental issues primarily. And we had gotten a report on the Upper Big Branch mine disaster, which a lot of you probably will remember. And they had done autopsies. There was a page in the report describing the autopsies that they'd done on the miners, and an astronomical percentage of them had black lung, and that was a shock to me. It was even more shocking to learn that government researchers had been documenting a resurgence of the disease. So that kind of set me on the path to looking into why this disease that I assumed, probably like most people, had been eradicated long ago was now surging back. And then that ultimately led me to also look at the benefits system and how miners are systematically deprived of benefits.
Right. Well, we thought that we might start out by giving, in addition to these introductions to ourselves, just a brief overview of the history of the black lung movement, just very briefly, because we wanted to get into additional or some conversation. But let me, just for those who may not be familiar with black lung and the history of the black lung movement, just note that despite what seems to be pretty obvious relationship between working underground in a coal mine, breathing dust every day, and the possibility of developing a severe and disabling lung disease, that connection was actually denied by the medical establishment in the United States and Britain and many other places in the world until the 20th century, the late 20th century. And in fact, it was really only after World War II when a generation of miners who had kept their jobs during a period of intensive mechanization, many miners lost their jobs. There was massive out-migration from the coal fields. But those who managed to keep their jobs were working in extremely dusty conditions with this new machinery. And by the mid to late 60s, these miners began retiring en masse from the mines. Many were quite significantly disabled with lung disease that they could get no compensation for whatsoever. It was not recognized in most states, in any states actually, until the mid-60s. And in West Virginia, which was the largest coal-producing state at the time, it was not recognized at all. And indeed, physicians in various medical societies lined up to deny the possibility that this was a legitimate condition. So miners organized through their local unions with support from a few sympathetic physicians, with some war on poverty, community organizers, and they marched, they held meetings, they raised money, and they went on strike in order to force the West Virginia legislature to recognize black lung as a compensable disease. Soon thereafter, the U.S. Coal Mine Health and Safety Act was passed in the wake of the Farmington mine explosion in November of 1968. And it was that legislation that inaugurated a federal black lung compensation program. And that program became the focus of a continuing controversy over black lung disease because miners who applied for federal compensation and widows who applied for compensation based on their deceased husband's record of lung disease or their experience of his lung disease were denied compensation. So there ensued a whole continuing controversy over who really controls the definition of this disease and who controls the levels at which disability is set. And so miners continue to organize and won reforms in the eligibility requirements during the 1970s. And one other thing to note about this period is that the initial federal compensation program was financed entirely by the U.S. Treasury and administered by the Social Security Administration. But the logic was that, okay, once we start controlling dust in mines, then this incidence of disease should drop drastically, and only coal operators who really aren't observing these dust limits should be liable, but they should be liable for future claims. So in the 70s, there was a shift from tax revenue financed black lung benefits to benefits financed by so-called responsible coal operators. And the process became adversarial, so coal companies could contest individual miners and their survivors' black lung claims, and that is the situation that we still face to this day. So Chris, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, and then the system that I came to see when I started looking into this was really a product of the 1980s, the early 1980s in large respect, and that was, there was a liberalization in some ways in 1978, 77 and 78 of the law, and the claims award rate went up quite a bit, and it reached about 50%, which was perhaps anomalously high. The Labor Department had implemented new rules that were starting to bring that back down, but what you have when the Reagan administration comes in is this looks like sort of a runaway entitlement program, and they see massive spending, and what ends up happening is there is legislation that's passed in the end of 1981, taking effect in 1982, that really changed the system, the compensation system going forward in a pretty dramatic way. What it not only rolled back the liberalized standards, but it actually undid some of the original protections in the law. And one of the key ones was this 15-year presumption, and this is something that exists in a number of workers' compensation settings, and it's a really difficult thing to deal with occupational disease. And so there was this presumption in the 1972 amendments that basically if a miner had worked 15 years or more in the mines and had a totally disabling respiratory impairment, that for purposes of the system, it would be presumed that the cause was coal dust. The amendments in 1981, 1982 did away with that. And then it also required widows not only to show that their husbands had black lung when they died, but that they died because of black lung. So you have these ridiculous scenarios where someone is totally disabled of black lung at the time of their death, but if they get injured in a car crash, the widow is out of luck. After this, the claims rate really dropped precipitously to about 4% by 1988, and it kind of has hovered there. It hovered there for quite a period of time. The other reason for that was, as Barbara Ellen said, became adversarial, and so miners were no longer taking on the government lawyers; they were taking on private lawyers paid by the coal companies, and this became extremely adversarial, and that really became the system that I looked at years later. And so, I mean, that really persisted until very recently. But you know, Barbara Ellen, I wanted to ask you. There's been so many things that I've been wanting to ask you actually after reading your book a while back, and then the new edition that just came out recently. But one of the things that really struck me about the recent resurgence was that we can sort of peg all these technical causes of it, but you know, as journalists and researchers and scientists do. But I'm wondering, you know, stepping back, one of the things that you've looked at is, I mean, what is really driving this resurgence of disease from a broader perspective?
Well, thanks. 'Cause that was a big, actually, a frustration with solely technical explanations was part of my motivation for updating this book, because I think the economics, the political economy, the coal industry has a whole lot to do with why we are seeing this resurgence of really severely disabling disease. And let me mention in that regard that the epicenter of that resurgence is really central Appalachia, and which is to say southern West Virginia, East Kentucky, and Southwest Virginia. And if you look at the really big picture, the political economy, the industry, what you see is that beginning in the 1970s, coal mining begins to shift west in the United States, and you get the development of these enormous strip mines in places like Wyoming and other states out west, where labor productivity is incredibly high. These are just massive surface mining operations with drag lines that are many stories high. So labor productivity is very high. It's relatively cheap in terms of labor cost per ton to get this coal out of the ground. The price of coal begins to fall eventually. And so coal operators who are mining in the east are really under significant competitive pressure to figure out how to cut their own costs in this context. So you begin to see companies selling out, just leaving the eastern coal fields altogether. Some of them begin mining coal with subcontractors, with smaller operators who then sell their coal to bigger ones. You begin to see bankruptcies. Those have really accelerated in more recent years. But there's kind of a shakeout going on in particularly the Appalachian coal industry. And that's especially true in central Appalachia, where the coal seams tend to be thinner. The great majority of really thin seam mines are in central Appalachia. And so the costs of getting that coal out of the ground tend to be much higher. So companies start cutting corners with their labor practices. You see efforts to, cut costs in terms of occupational safety and health, and you see ultimately the effort to undermine and then get rid of the United Mine Workers of America so that they won't have to pay into union pension plans, union health care coverage, and so on. A.T. Massey really spearheads this drive in the 1980s, but it's also evident in the Piston strike, which the United Mine Workers wages pretty heroically and very strategically, and wins in some respects, but ultimately the union cannot hold back this anti-union offensive, which of course is aided on the political side by what Chris was mentioning, the Reagan administration, a very anti-labor atmosphere, so that you get the union being sued and fined and rulings about the size of its picket lines. You get state police protecting non-union coal trucks. You get state police protecting non-union workers crossing picket lines and so on. And so there's really this massive assault on the union, and it's particularly severe in central Appalachia and southern West Virginia, so that today fewer than 10% of the workforce, it's about 7% as of 2018, in Central Appalachia is a member of the United Mine Workers, and that's much lower. It's much more significant than in other subregions of Appalachia. So you get rid of the union, you cut in costs, you talk to miners about this situation, and they just, over and over again, I hear miners talk about what happened during this period and what indeed continues to happen today, and that is that there is this emphasis on running coal, productivity at all costs. You know, don't worry about your water sprays on the equipment. Don't worry about dust sampling. Just put it in your dinner bucket or hang it in the air intake where the fresh air comes into the mine. Don't worry about the increasing dust levels. Just get that coal. And miners talk about how they don't even know when their shift is going to end, because if somebody calls in sick or fails to show up for work, then you work a double shift. And indeed, the data from the Mine Safety and Health Administration indicate that the number of hours that miners work has increased by about a third over the last several decades. So there's just this intense productivity pressure going on, and in many cases a willful disregard of health and safety practices. So that's it's a setup for all kinds of health and safety problems, and certainly an increase in occupational lung disease. But then in addition to that, and particularly in Central Appalachia, in these thin seam mines, you have miners who are increasingly having to drill through rock to even get at the seam. And this is where the technical explanations come into play, because that rock, it turns out, is high in silica content, which researchers will tell you works like, as one mentioned or described it, works like ground glass. It's extremely harmful to the lungs. And so it's also a carcinogen, actually. So in my view, it's extremely important, of course, to emphasize the role of silica, and we need a specific standard for silica in underground coal mines, a more strict one than we have and a more specific one. But I would argue that the cause of this whole situation is more the changing political economy of the industry than this inert material, human beings who put the situation in motion. So let me turn to you, Chris, and ask you, your book recounts many, many moving stories about miners and their families' efforts to get federal black lung compensation. So I'm just wondering, again, people may not be familiar with what it really means to try to gain benefits when you are already, severely disabled by lung disease. So I'm wondering if you could just perhaps recount one of those stories that were related to you, and perhaps talk a little bit about how this situation might be improved, what it would take to do that.
Yeah, over the course of reporting that I have been doing over the years, I've really seen the human toll of what you described, of the, basically all of the technical causes with, as you describe it, the sort of larger social, political, and economic drivers there. But it really has a gut-wrenching toll on these miners, and it is shocking to sit in the living room with someone who otherwise looks like a relatively young, healthy man, and just from having a conversation with you, he is eventually struggling for breath, and there's a gasp that comes with it that is just, you will never forget it if you hear it with a miner who has severe lung disease. But the benefits system has really evolved in a lot of ways to be kind of the worst of all worlds for miners. It has elements of workers' compensation system, but it also has elements of high-stakes civil litigation and it kind of combines the worst of those from a miner's perspective. And what I mean is that a workers' compensation system, the idea is that the employer has the liability capped, meaning there's only so much you're going to pay out. And in this case, it is relatively modest monthly benefits, usually range from somewhere to around $700 to $1,100 a month, depending on how many dependents the miner has, plus medical coverage for lung disease-related treatment. So that liability is capped for the employer, but then in return, you make it a little bit easier for the worker to prove his or her claim. Well, in this system, the employer gets the capped liability, but it really isn't that much easier for the miner to prove his or her claim. And then at the same time, you have companies fighting this as if it is a $1 million lawsuit in a lot of cases, where they're just is, these cases will drag on for 10, 15. I've even, followed the case of miners who've lasted more than 20 years trying to get benefits. And I think, one that really stood out to me that I started following his story in 2013 was a miner named Steve Day. And he was kind of the epitome of what happened in central Appalachia. Worked at the face for many years for a large coal company, and eventually contracted severe black lung. But he was, when I met him, he had lost his case, and the government was actually coming after him for repayment of the interim benefits that he'd been paid after he initially won. And it was just puzzling to me how he'd lost his case. And it was then that I started to see that you have all these cases where there's just seemingly puzzling outcomes, where you have miners who are being treated for black lung. They have large masses on their x-rays that no one can really fully explain, and that their doctors believe is black lung, but that the company's doctor says is probably something else. And these miners end up losing their claims. And that was what happened with Steve. And it was only really sadly in his case that he finally died, and his autopsy proved that he had severe, just an extensive case of black lung. But it took that for him to win his claim, and that is unfortunately that is too common. And but I think one of the reasons for that is something that I really started to see in the specific context, like in Steve's case and other miners' case. But I mean, it's something that I think you've written about eloquently, Barbara Ellen, which is this fight over black lung. And I only came to realize this later after doing a lot of reading, but this fight over black lung has really, in a lot of ways, been a fight over what the definition of the disease is. And medical professionals have really kind of had a complicit role in this in a lot of cases, and kind of have acted as gatekeepers, almost, defining what the disease is and telling miners that, what you're experiencing is not legitimate, just because we don't have some sort of objective way of measuring exactly your level of disease or something like that. And, I'm wondering if, Barbara Ellen, if you could just kind of go through, the history of that and why you think that's been the case and why it's still happening today.
Yeah, sure, I can try to. It's a long history, and so I'll obviously shorten it and try to be brief. But there's a lot of evidence that, going back to the 19th century and well before that, coal miners themselves, people who lived in coal mining districts, people familiar with them, novelists, there's popular literature that shows a widespread awareness of a relationship between dust inhalation and the kind of disabling respiratory conditions that coal miners tended to have as they aged. you know, spitting up huge gobs of black sputum, and of course, just a constant chronic struggle to breathe. You even find in the United States, for example, physicians in the 19th century observing these problems and attributing them to coal miners' work. And so what's particularly disturbing, astonishing, I'm not sure what to call it, is that you get this blanket of silence that falls over the problem, at least on the part of the medical profession, by the early 20th century or so. And I think there are a lot of explanations for that. One is certainly the rise of the company doctor system, because as the Appalachian coal industry expanded, coal companies developed company towns in which they controlled housing, food supply, the stores, the railroad access to towns, and the healthcare delivery system. So you had physicians treating miners who had no incentive whatsoever because they were controlled by the company. Their employment was controlled by the company. No incentive whatsoever to identify work-related lung disease among miners. But I think there are other factors too that have to do with the history of medical science during this period. It involved what some people call a phase of laboratory medicine, or increasing emphasis on scientific testing to validate what patients reported as their own condition. And so, you know, some people talk about this as kind of a period when the sick person disappears from medicine because the validity of what people say they are experiencing in their own bodies comes to take a decidedly secondary place to the validating processes of medical testing. And for coal miners, that becomes the X-ray. That becomes extremely important. And physicians would look at X-rays of miners' lungs and not see anything that they recognized as any kind of classically impairing condition, and they were informed in part by silica, ironically enough, because that was a more recognized problem, that is to say, silicosis. So, as you know, we were talking about earlier, there's a whole lengthy period during the development of the Appalachian coal industry, late 19th into the 20th century. Generation after generation of coal miners are contracting lung disease, especially intensively with mechanization. But physicians deny any kind of relationship between coal dust inhalation in the workplace and any kind of disabling lung disease. They tend to attribute it to alcoholism or individual habits like, you know, other harmful behaviors. Cigarette smoking, of course, is often invoked, but there's a steadfast refusal to acknowledge a relationship between work exposures and lung disease. This begins to change when the United Mine Workers, in the period immediately after World War II, manages to gain, through collective bargaining, a union-controlled healthcare system that kind of reverses the company doctor system by requiring the industry, as opposed to miners who had to pay the company doctor but didn't control his employment. Now the industry pays through a tonnage royalty for healthcare, but in effect the union controls the medical care delivery system. And so you get physicians now being hired not directly by the union, but by the union-financed health system, who are in some cases quite interested in public health, in possibility of a relationship between workplace exposure and lung disease, and they begin publishing articles, some of them quite polemical because they're aware of the denial of lung disease that is occupationally related among coal miners. But still, despite that, because that begins in the 50s, by the late 60s, you still, as we mentioned earlier, in a state like West Virginia, have physicians denying the legitimacy of coal miners' lung disease. And it really takes the political intervention of coal miners and their families insisting on the legitimacy of their own experience of disease. And that's really, is a very important thread, this kind of conflict between medical and also legal definitions of black lung and what those who actually experience this disease or see it up close in their family members know to be their own lived reality. So speaking of that, conflict or contradiction between how some physicians have viewed black lung and how miners themselves have experienced it. Chris, you really did an amazing investigative job of uncovering the work of the radiologist, Dr. Paul Wheeler, who was at Johns Hopkins, and who read thousands of x-rays of coal miners' lungs in federal black lung compensation claims. And not once did he find advanced, severely disabling black lung disease, not once. It's really quite an appalling story. So I'm just wondering if you could talk some about that. You did an amazing research job to uncover that, but also just how do you see this physician's stance in relation to this long history of medical controversy over black lung?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it does fit within that continued history of what you were describing of sort of keeping a narrow definition of what the disease is, and that serves to shut out miners who don't have a particular appearance of disease. And in the case of Dr. Wheeler, I mean, I should say his record made him an outlier, and he was extremely prolific, which was one reason he had such an outsized impact, as well as the fact that he had a very impressive resume and was a prominent doctor at Johns Hopkins, which carries a lot of weight in the benefits system. But he also, his view was not necessarily all completely different from some of the other doctors who frequently read X-rays for coal companies, but he just had this very strict view of what the disease looks like on an X-ray, and it has to meet all these very, very specific criteria. And if it didn't look like that, to him, it would not be, or almost certainly was not, black lung. And, it was only when I started to look at, one, his record, and then two, what the medical literature actually has been saying over recent decades, and what other experts I have also been saying, based on their own experience treating miners. And you see that these rules that he had are really not hard and fast, and in many cases they've been discredited or disproven, yet he continued to apply them, and because of the way the benefits system worked, it was very difficult to challenge that. And it was really, only in recent years when his record when it became apparent what his full record was, and that there have been attempts to change that. There is now a quality control system that is being set up, so a little scrutiny has sort of shaken that. But I will say this idea of keeping the disease kind of in a box is not over, and it's not limited to readings and compensation claims on that issue either. I mean, there's an increasing recognition that coal dust causes scarring and impairment of many types. It can vary among, different people respond differently to dust. And even now, we're sort of seeing new variations on the disease that don't look exactly like the classic model, but are increasingly being recognized. And it's just, it's amazing to me because looking back in the history that you described, Barbara Ellen, it's, I saw so much of the present moment in a lot of that history. But I know this is something, and I'm really interested to hear your take on this because obviously you're an expert on black lung, but you also, have done a lot of labor work more broadly. And it seems to me that this narrow, these constraints, these medical definitions of the disease, it's not just the coal industry, right? I mean, this is something that is a broader issue in occupational health and that workers deal with across a range of industries, right?
Yeah, let me speak to that. But let me start by kind of picking up on what you're referencing, Chris, which is the sort of the multiple disease processes that are at stake here in what's called black lung. Because I think one of the errors that a lot of people make, and you see this often in articles about black lung and the black lung activism and so forth, is to equate black lung with coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which is by definition a work-related lung disease that can be disabling in certain points. But coal miners can also get bronchitis, they can get emphysema, they can get other diseases from occupational dust exposure. Now, they can also get emphysema from cigarette smoking, and you can get bronchitis from, inhaling a lot of polluted air in your neighborhood. So part of the problem with this compensation situation is the bar that you have to reach to prove that something is occupationally related. And on an individual case, when you're looking at evidence, for example, of advanced emphysema, a physician can't necessarily say for that individual claimant, is that due to occupational exposure, such that the compensation, should be provided through the federal black lung system, or is it some other cause? And that's where there's a real, I think, very important relationship between black lung and black lung activism and the medical politics around black lung and workers in other industries, because there's so many industries in which workers are exposed to, for example, hazardous chemicals that cause kidney cancer or bladder cancer or whatever. But you could also contract those cancers from other non-occupational sources. So part of the problem that this whole system is pushing up against is the incapacity of medical science to allocate, disease causation on an individual basis. But that also, I think, means that it's incredibly important for both workers and people in communities who are facing environmental hazards to really not be intimidated or stopped in their tracks by the fact that they feel that they are experiencing health problems, lung disease, cancers, whatever it might be, that collectively seems to be affecting the community, the neighborhood, the workplace, the larger group of workers, to insist on the reality of that, because in many cases, the scientific research just simply doesn't exist to prove a relationship. That's surely true in the case of many chemicals, for example. We experienced that here in Charleston when storage tanks that contained chemicals that are used to clean coal began leaching into the water supply for hundreds of thousands of people. And, folks were smelling licorice as they ran their faucets. People were developing rashes and so forth. But there was no, scientific research that could say, oh, well, this threshold is safe, but that's not. it's simply not known. And I mean, we live today in a chemical soup, so in which there's, there are many substances that are not well understood in terms of their consequences for human health. So the point is that I think that the black lung struggle has relevance across many industries and also communities that are facing environmental hazards. And I just have to make a note about that, because I think, one of the real original sins of public health is to divide occupational health from environmental health. When, people who work in a place like Shirley in southern West Virginia are not only breathing coal dust underground, but they're also breathing it because they live next to the preparation plant or whatever. And so to not understand disease more holistically becomes very problematic. And it also, frankly, undergirds this competition between jobs, the workplace, protect your job, and, don't worry about the environmental effects. But, the reality is that our bodies are experiencing both seamlessly. So, yeah. So I'm interested, Chris, you began your investigation, as you mentioned. It was really at a time when the resurgence of black lung was becoming evident, and in more recent years, the clarity that it's really very severe disease that's rising. So I'm wondering, given the sort of regulatory infrastructure for coal mining, which is lodged with the Mine Safety and Health Administration, or what people call MSHA, what do you see as that agency's kind of culpability in terms of a failure to prevent this kind of resurgence of black lung? And, what changes would be necessary?
It's an interesting and difficult question. I mean, the sampling system, as it relies pretty heavily on companies to self-police. Inspectors do sample occasionally, but most of the dust sampling to prove compliance with the standard is done by the companies. There's really, one thing that was shocking to me is, when I would talk to guys who had been in the mines, they would just describe rampant fraud and cheating as just sort of, they would talk about it matter-of-factly, as if it were just a known sort of an open secret in the industry. And it really has been. When I went back and looked at the history of this, it has been since the 70s, really. It has not been secret that there are all sorts of ways to really game this system and not take samples that actually show what the miners are breathing, and to make it look like you're complying with the law when you're not really. And then there are all sorts of loopholes in the law, like getting to average 5 samples and only the average has to be in compliance, or getting to run the pumps to sample for only part of a shift if it's longer than 8 hours. There are all sorts of these things that the coal operators would sort of figure out ways to take advantage of that. And then you also had pretty widespread where it would just, as you've described, you would just either put tape over the sampling device, or you would go hang it in the clean air back out by, or, you just hear these stories so many times, and these guys almost take it as a granted that it's going to happen. But in 2014, the MSHA enacted a pretty long-sought regulation. Now, it lowered the dust standard, but not as much as public health officials had recommended. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health had actually recommended in 1995 cutting the dust limit in half. The new standard didn't go quite that far. But if you talk with a lot of the people in the regulatory community, they will argue that the key thing to that regulation was closing a lot of the loopholes and also requiring the use of this continuous sampling device that has a computer instead of an old-fashioned filter that the dust collects on, and it should theoretically be harder to cheat. It's not clear yet whether that's going to be the case. The numbers look pretty good on compliance so far, but of course the numbers looked pretty good on compliance before too, and it turned out that they weren't real. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention, because this is that your silica comments are really timely here, and I think there's really good evidence that that's what's driving a lot of this resurgence. And that has been something that has been on regulators' radar for years, but it hasn't really materialized into a rulemaking. There is not a separate standard for silica that is enforceable. It's this complicated formula that's part of the overall dust limit, but there are games that coal companies have played to get around that as well. And interestingly enough, it was either today or yesterday, I'm not sure if it was just released, but the Labor Department Inspector General just released a report finding that MSHA was doing an inadequate job of protecting miners from silica. So that is something where the Labor Department issued a request for information this year, and so they've gathered comments on it, but they have not acted. And I think there's a lot of pressure from people in this community to act on that. And so it'll be very interesting to see, particularly with the new administration, also what happens with this. But one thing that I've thought about a lot, and I've kind of pressed regulators when I've tried to assess the effect of these reforms, is you've closed the loopholes, but you fundamentally haven't changed the system in which it relies on company self-policing. And it may not be practical to have any other system. It would be incredibly difficult to have MSHA inspectors go on all these mines. But I'm wondering, Barbara Ellen, what if you've given the larger social and political and economic factors that you described so well earlier, I'm wondering if there's any sort of system for policing the mines that relies largely on self-policing that can work. And if not, what might be some other potential solutions for protecting miners going forward?
Oh gosh, that's a tall order in this context. I mean, because as you point out, it relies so much on the current system relies so much on companies to self-police, and there's just so much evidence that if a company wants to cheat on dust sampling, they can, and there's just there's really not sufficient disincentive in terms of not cheating or the incentive not to cheat. So I don't mean to sound anti-regulation, because I absolutely believe that, for example, setting the dust standard and lowering it, as this rule that you mentioned in 2014 did, is hugely important, because it creates a kind of threshold target, and it's something very tangible that miners and others can, peg themselves to if they are able and willing, but able is especially the word there, to try to enforce, dust limits underground or above ground, for that matter. But I guess, what I conclude by looking at the long history of particularly black lung is that in the absence of greater collective power on workers' part, it's going to be really, really difficult to eliminate this disease, or even perhaps reduce it significantly, because of course we're seeing now the result of practices that occurred 10, 20 years ago. Black lung, I guess we haven't mentioned this, but it has a latency period. It takes a while to manifest. And meanwhile, the coal industry is collapsing. And so employment in the industry is really just falling off a cliff. And so on the one hand, that means you've got, of course, far fewer workers being exposed to dust levels. But at the same time, it also means that the mines that do remain in operation, because of the fortunes of the coal industry, are under tremendous pressure to mine as cheaply as possible. And so, I frankly think that the collapse of the coal industry is going to be more decisive in reducing black lung disease than MSHA's regulations. But that sounds very cynical. And I do think that we really need a separate standard for silica, and the Inspector General's report that you just mentioned really stresses that. OSHA now has a standard for silica, and yet in coal mines where we have, workers really being afflicted with silica-related dust disease, there's not a separate standard for which sampling is done for silica. So it's a crazy situation. So before we turn to some questions from folks who are listening, because I hear my phone beeping, which means there's some questions coming in. One of the really important aspects of your investigation, Chris, was the work that you did in documenting the actions of Jackson Kelly, the coal operators' go-to law firm here in Charleston, West Virginia. Actually, it's got offices all over the place, but you really offer a fascinating history of it. I didn't realize that this law firm dates back to the early 19th century, to the period before West Virginia was even a state, when it was formed pretty much to defend the interests of those who sought to own land and develop industry and build their wealth in this part of the world. And today, of course, it defends coal companies against miners' black lung claims. Your investigation documented tactics that, though they may technically be legal, are pretty morally reprehensible on the part of Jackson Kelly's lawyers. And I'm just wondering if you could describe what you found, and also talk a little about how you understand their actions. Is it just sort of bad apples, or is this how the law works, or particularly in relationship to workers, or how do you understand that situation?
Yeah. Well, so the way that I got into looking at the benefits system, and this dates back to 2012, I believe, when I was first reporting in southern West Virginia on what was causing the resurgence of the disease. And it was there that I met John Klein, who was an attorney by then, but he had actually come to the coalfields as an idealistic 20-something, as a VISTA volunteer, Volunteers in Service to America. It's like the domestic version of the Peace Corps, and it was part of the war on poverty. And he ended up staying and becoming, well, he was a carpenter and then had a home building business, and he and his father ran a business that built homes for people who qualified for government-backed low-interest loan programs. And then he eventually went to work at a rural medical clinic, which was one of the clinics that actually received government funding to diagnose and treat miners who have black lung. And he was a benefits counselor, and it was there that he actually started helping miners with their claims and representing them as a lay representative in cases. And that was something that was a little bit probably crazy at the time, given that lawyers wouldn't even take a lot of these cases. But but John started to uncover, he was taking on this law firm, Jackson Kelly, a lot, and in a number of cases, because they are the go-to firm for a lot of the big coal companies in Appalachia. And what he started to see in the early 90s was what he felt like was a pattern of withholding critical medical evidence in benefits cases that was causing miners to be wrongfully denied of their claims. And it was something where he really pushed over this and sort of case by case by case unraveled it. And it was ultimately the case of a man named Gary Fox. And so my book is really focused on the interweaving narratives of Gary Fox and John Klein and the implications that case has for other miners. And it's sort of the culmination of this fight. And, Gary, what happened to him basically was that he had lost his original claim because the law firm had withheld a critical pathology report that two critical pathology reports that showed that their own experts believed he had severe black lung. He ended up losing his claim and having to go back into the mines because his family couldn't be without health insurance because his wife had a chronic disease that was very expensive to treat. And he would continue to breathe the dust and got so sick that he, when he finally got out and filed a subsequent claim, he died while the claim was ongoing, while trying to get a lung transplant. But it was really that case that he pushed literally onto his deathbed, and then his wife pushed afterward to force the law firm, Jackson Kelly, to disclose the reports that they'd withheld in the previous case. And it was ultimately that was the case that ended up being critical in making everyone see what John Klein had been seeing and what he had been arguing for almost 20 years at that point. And what you have in 2016 is the Labor Department ended up enacting a rule that required disclosure of all medical evidence in benefits claims by both sides, regardless of whether anyone asked. And this was really what John had been seeking for so long. And it was a remarkable thing to see this happen. I mean, that actually happened after I started working on the book and while I was doing the reporting. So it was really encouraging to see that. But, in terms of assessing, the state of the law, it was complicated because, the attorneys at Jackson Kelly, first of all, they did not want to talk with me for the most part, which is not surprising in stories like this, and that's certainly their right to do that. I wish they had, because I think I really wanted to understand their motivations, and I think that's because you look at the lawyers, and they are people who could be your next door neighbors in suburbia. They're at your church. They're participating in all the local civic organizations, donating their time. They're prominent, esteemed lawyers, and I wanted to understand how they could, at the same time, justify doing something that seemed so obviously harmful to very vulnerable people. And, it ultimately, it came down to, I think it's a larger thing that you see in the law a lot of times, is that the adversarial system functions a certain way in this country, and that whatever results from whatever is legally permissible must also be, or probably is also, justifiable, which is not necessarily the case. And so it's really, I think it highlights that split between what you can do and what you ought to do. And that was something that I really hope to bring to light to some degree, in this book. I don't know, Barbara, did you want to move to questions now? I saw some.
Yeah, I did, but I just want to praise the investigative work that you did, and note that, in the context of some of the gloom and doom we've spoken of, that was a very important victory.
Yeah. I see a question here that actually there was something, it was kind of a follow-up to something that I asked you earlier that if it's okay, I think I'll ask you to field this one. This comes from a viewer, Paul Sheridan. Any thoughts on whether science denial in the industrial context or in other contexts, climate change, COVID, is evolving and responding to other political, economic, and cultural factors? It seems like something that would be.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and in part I want to answer it by clarifying that I think that the struggle between miners and their families and physicians over the definition of black lung and, for example, where you set disability in terms of tests of lung function and so on, did not, for the most part, involve a denial of science per se, because there have always been physicians who agreed with miners' sense of their own condition. Dr. Donald Rasmussen, much beloved, worked for many, many years in Beckley, West Virginia. More recently, Dr. Bob Cohen in Chicago is kind of mantle that Rasmussen held has fallen on him. Both esteemed researchers. And I would also note that coal miners and those who became lay advocates, that is to say, often miners' wives, widows, daughters, brothers, whatever, who argued black lung compensation claims and assisted people with their claims, developed very sophisticated understandings of X-rays and all of the details of medical evidence that's required in black lung claims. So I don't want to give the impression that this struggle involved a kind of denial of science and an assertion that, well, whatever we think is true, or something parallel to what we're seeing, for example, with COVID and the denial of the severity of that disease, or something parallel with climate change. I guess what I would say, though, is that I think the black lung case really illustrates or it offers a kind of caution about the role of science in problems that are fundamentally about unequal political power or lack of political power, and about things like economic exploitation. Science has an incredibly important role to play as a resource in those struggles, but it's not going to solve those problems. The solutions are more fundamentally, I think, political and economic. But then that's all about sort of how to answer that question in the context of black lung. I think it's a really interesting question, though, to think about, the desire by some to move politically through science denialism, and that is for sure a very serious problem. Whether it's morphing, I'm not sure. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to know, and I guess I would just say, as you know, I mean, science is kind of it can cut either way. In some respects, I mean, you can use it to achieve a lot of good, but as you described, I mean, it can also be used to kind of jam the disease in a box and overly narrowly define it. And I guess in some ways it kind of seems like the limits of our technical prowess in terms of what we're able to detect scientifically may have implications that we don't intend for workers and for just public health generally, because just because we don't yet understand how to measure or detect some sort of causal agent or impairment doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't there. And so I guess that's my 2 cents on that. But I think it is just scientifically fraught world that we're living in these days. I see here, this would actually, I know I'm kind of firing them at you here, but I see a question here from Grant Crandall that also I think would be a really interesting one that you might have some thoughts on, Barbara Ellen. He says, what are your views of the role of the Black Lung Association and the United Mine Workers Union in fighting for the rights of miners with black lung from the time of Miners for Democracy forward? And what lessons do you draw from that history for the role of social movements in fighting for the rights of workers? I mean, you were part of that movement, and you've written about it so well. What's your take on that?
Well, it's a huge question. Love you, Grant. Grant Crandall was a really important force in West Virginia as a lawyer, and then also became the general counsel for the United Mine Workers. So part of what I was trying to suggest in my earlier comments about the resurgence of black lung disease is the just totally fundamental importance of a strong union for workers to be able to enforce health and safety standards in their workplaces. There's really just no substitute for that kind of collective organization. The union in different periods has had varying degrees of commitment to occupational health and safety, but in the wake of the Miners for Democracy and its election to the leadership of the union in 1972, even though there were some bumps after that, certainly the subsequent leadership by the current president, Cecil Roberts, and also the former president, Rich Trumka, who's now the head of the AFL-CIO, has really carried on that tradition of commitment to workplace health and safety. And the Black Lung Associations, I think, had a really, really important role to play throughout this period in terms of advocating for changes in the federal compensation program and also assisting individual miners. And that the combination of the two, that is to say, in effect, the kind of community-based organization of coal mining people that was inclusive of a lot of women. The union, of course, includes women now too, because women have gone into the mines, but in far lower numbers. It's a terrifically powerful combination, because you have, the institutional power of the union seeking to lobby for black lung reform, for example, and you also have black lung associations organizing trips of miners with their oxygen tanks and wheelchairs and so on to come to DC and really demonstrate the severity of this disease. So I think there's no, I don't know of any substitute for that. Yeah. And right now, the union is, as I was mentioning earlier, really impaired in central Appalachia, where this disease is so significantly surging, or has so significantly surged. And so it's the Black Lung Associations in some ways have become, at least in a social sense and to some degree a political sense, substitutes for local unions. I mean, going to Black Lung Association meetings these days is really, is often in context where there are no functioning local unions. And so miners gather, and you hear people, trading stories about what they did underground and so on. But in the absence of a strong union to complement that, especially at the, that more local level in the mines, to insist on enforcement of dust standards and so on, it becomes very difficult, I think, to prevent disease.
I know that the Black Lung associations are not doing it now, obviously because of COVID, but just last year, even in the middle of 2019, they were up here. I'm based in DC, so they were up here, lobbying as always. The issues now, right, are the coal excise tax is set to expire at the end of this year, and this is the tax that that companies pay on per ton of coal to finance the trust fund that pays miners benefits in cases when the company's either gone out of business or going through bankruptcy, which is increasingly happening these days, unfortunately. And if that tax rate will revert back to the level that the Reagan administration deemed unsustainable in the 80s, unless Congress acts by the end of this year. So, there's still lots of active issues on the table, and it's, the Black Lung Association is still very active. And, recently it was interesting. I don't know if you saw this, Barbara Ellen, but they've revived the Black Lung Bulletin, which I know was something that, John Klein would haul this around and take it to all the local union shops in the 70s, early 70s, and it kind of went silent because there was, they won their reforms, but now it's started back up again. So I don't know. I mean, maybe this is the return of the rank and file miners movement, similar to what was in 1968 or 69, but that may. Obviously, there are a lot of differences now, but I don't know if it's possible to revive something like that. But yeah, it's the Black Lung Association is revived and going strong. Good to see that.
Yeah. There's one quick question here from Leslie Guidey that's asking, where are there still coal mines? I thought most of the work had been automated, and certainly there has been a lot of automation, especially, underground with long wall machinery, out west with massive strip jobs, as we were talking about earlier. But there are still coal mines, actually all over the country, in out west, as well as in the so-called Illinois Basin, Illinois, Western Kentucky, and as well as in Appalachia. But it's less at this point because of automation and more because the industry is collapsing, that there are many mines are shutting down. Employment is way down, and as Chris was mentioning, many companies are going bankrupt. So.
But I would say that some of the economic circumstances actually seem to be increasing the dangers for miners in some of these smaller mines in central Appalachia, because the trend that you described of the economics making it now possible to go after these thin seams, which means cutting a lot more rock. And then, NIOSH has also, I think, they've shown through published studies that, there is a correlation between smaller mines and a higher incidence of disease. So in many respects, these dog hole or punch hole mines, as a lot of people call them, are almost, more dangerous. And so to the degree that those are springing up in Appalachia to respond to both the decline of major companies and also, just when the price of metallurgical coal rises internationally, they open up some punch holes. So, I think that could actually be increasing the dangers for some of the miners who do work in those conditions. And now that the union, they're so, as you noted, so free or unionized, I think they don't feel protected to speak up about conditions, even less than they probably ever did to some degree. So it's a really difficult situation.
It is, and just your mention of metallurgical coal makes me think of some analyses that I've read recently by business press about the coal industry and the fact that if we get a major infrastructure package passed through Congress, metallurgical coal mining may actually get a renewed lease on life because of the steel required in those infrastructure projects, which would be interesting.
Yeah, and that was, as you write in your book, I mean, the decline of the domestic steel industry was really what hollowed out a lot of Central Appalachia, the met mines, at least in the first place years ago. So that's interesting. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. So maybe one other question. We just got a few minutes left. There's one here about the Friends of Coal propaganda campaign, and just the question, perhaps sharing our thoughts on those. That was Friends of Coal is still evident for sure. Bumper stickers that you see quite frequently in East Kentucky, West Virginia, and so on. And was very much a kind of industry financed campaign, particularly took off during the Obama administration and targeted environmental regulation as being the cause of the decline in the coal industry. We know that there are many factors, and they have a lot to do with the growth of natural gas, renewables, and just the market decline of coal. But nonetheless, it was very, and remains, I think, a very politically important argument. Some people have analyzed that as just kind of an astroturf argument or organization, that is to say that it was just industry financed and didn't really have a lot of depth in terms of support among people in the coal fields. I'm really not, I wouldn't agree with that, just because I see too much evidence in the statements that I hear folks making that environmental regulation is to blame, and that there is and has been a war on coal. So I think it's been extremely powerful, and unfortunately, one of the reasons it's been so powerful, I think, is again because we haven't had a union presence or another presence and voice that could counter that argument. So, and it's been quite sophisticated in terms of infiltrating the public schools and pro-coal lesson plans and presentations and so forth. It's evident in the bumper stickers and so on. There's been lots of ad campaigns that associate coal with manly coal miners and American nationalism. So it's really ringing a lot of cultural bells to promote the idea that any kind of regulation of the industry is totally harmful to it and should be repudiated by any loyal coal mining people, which, given the collapse of the coal industry, is incredibly harmful in terms of being able to envision alternative futures.
Yeah, ultimately, there's going to have to be, whatever you believe about the reason for the decline, I think there's general agreement that the industry is in decline and that there has to be a different future for that region. So, yeah, I mean, it really inhibits having a productive conversation when you offer overly simplistic explanations of it. So I think a lot of people would be better served to have frank conversations with people who live in that area about what the future looks like, and I hope that will happen.
Great. I think we're just about out of time, Chris. You want to close us out?
Well, so I really, this has been a great discussion. I'm so glad that I got a chance to finally talk to you face to face, Varellen, because your book was so incredibly helpful to me as I worked on mine. And I would just recently reading the updated version has been so it's been so interesting over the last few weeks. I just got my copy. And so I'm so glad we got to talk, and I really would encourage people to, if you haven't already picked up Digging Our Own Graves, you got to pick it up. Get the new one if you already have the old one. I also just want to thank Haymarket and Little Brown for hosting this. It's been a lot of fun for me. So, thank you.
You too. Thank you.